Hello and welcome to Glamour and Goosebumps, where we talk about all the weird, the creepy, and the unexplained. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about 4 Bigfoot stories. That's right, I said 4. Lots of juicy details and evidence for you to get your Bigfoot fix for the week. But before we get started on that, I have to pivot your attention to my boys at TTM Podcast. We just recently did a story on the Travis Walton abduction that happened in 1975, and you guys have to check it out. We talked about new evidence and just really compelling information from his abduction, one of the most credible abductions in U.S. history. So go ahead and check it out in the description box. You will have the link to the TTM Podcast. Please like and subscribe, and you will receive videos from me every Thursday to get your spook fix for the week. I hope you guys enjoy this segment on Bigfoot. So let's go ahead and get started. Today's stories are going to come straight out of Bigfoot Lives in Idaho book by Becky Cook. And I really have been enjoying this book because I feel like she has very interesting stories of Bigfoot and people who have claimed to see Bigfoot. And a lot of the stories, the reason why I find them so credible is because they come from like hunters and outdoorsmen. And like the reality is that they're out in the woods a lot, right? So they would be the people that if Sasquatch and if Bigfoot really did exist, that they would be the ones to see him. Am I right? So I really, really love kind of a few of her stories, and I wanted to share a couple with hopes that, of course, you guys would then purchase her book. And so here's what her book looks like. Bigfoot Lives in Idaho, and this is just edition 1 that I'll be like kind of pulling a lot of this information from. So she actually has 3 books, and you've got to check them out because if you are a true Sasquatch lover and if you are a believer of Bigfoot, then I think that you can get a little bit out of reading these stories and kind of hearing these first-hand testimonies. So the first story that we are going to talk about today is of Dave Higley. And Dave Higley is, of course, a hunter, and he lives in Idaho. So he lives closer to like the southeastern side, kind of almost like closer to like the tip of Idaho. And the reason why I find Dave's story so credible is because he's seen one in the 70s, which is the first story I'm going to tell you, and then he saw another one just a couple years ago on another hunting trip. So I would say that if these hunters are outside, they probably have a pretty good chance of seeing Bigfoot, right? Well, Dave was one of the lucky ones because he happened to see 2. So this story would take place in Bloody Bucket, which is basically, I know, really crazy name, right? But Bloody Bucket is where a lot of hunters go to bag an elk. So Dave would be at Bloody Bucket 1978, and he would be kind of walking through the woods and coming down the hillside because he had just gone kind of hunting up on the hill looking for elk, but unfortunately like didn't get anything. So as he's coming down the hillside, he notices 20 feet away, you guys, like, whew, that's so freaking close. He sees a Bigfoot staring straight at him. And he knows it's Bigfoot because he's close enough. There's no denying that this is Bigfoot. So of course he's extremely startled. He doesn't have a camera or anything like that. Bigfoot would look up at him. And what Dave would describe is that like this creature was about 6.5 feet tall, 800 pounds of just solid muscle. So he was a big boy, very, very much big boy. And he definitely said that he, just thought that it was a male, just the way that it was standing and kind of its body and how big it was. But it didn't try to hurt him in any way. So Dave actually just like was very, very slow. And, didn't try to grab his rifle or shoot him or anything like that. But he was just very slow with his movements. And then the Sasquatch would just disappear into the woods, never to be seen again. So Dave would go back to his truck, take a really big sigh of relief, and say to himself, they do exist. Dave, never thinking that he would get the opportunity to see Bigfoot again, would be caught very much by surprise a couple years back when he was over, again, hunting at, over by Soda Springs, which is in the southeastern part of Idaho, and then he was, off of the 8 Mile Road. he would be walking out into a clearing and just notice this tall creature kind of walking in the woods in front of him. Now, of course, it wasn't as close as the other, 20-foot encounter that he had where he was so close to Bigfoot he could practically touch him. But he knew exactly what it was from his last encounter and got extremely excited. He went to go grab his camera so that this time he could have some type of proof of what he had seen. But unfortunately, right as he would grab his camera, because the creature was like a little bit further away from him, it would unfortunately disappear before he could get a shot of it. So in 2007, Rod Bidwell would be kind of on a hunting trip with his friends. He'd be riding horseback through the mountains and he would come along this creek bed. So it was right at dusk, so it was getting pretty late. The sun was starting to set. The birds were no longer chirping in the trees, and they were really trying to set up their camp next to this creek and, just make bed for the night. So he's on his horses and he's walking, his horses to his campsite, and he hears this really loud screeching scream. And he said that it was really crazy because he had never heard anything quite like it before. It was really loud. It kept the same volume, and it was like more of like a shriek, something he had never heard before. So he hears these screams, and he hears this like really loud kind of noise coming from the woods. So he's in the creek. There's two, woods on each side of the creek bed, and he's walking, and then he hears these growls coming from the left side of the river. So right side he hears the scream, left side he hears these growls, as if like two Sasquatches were trying to communicate with each other. But at the time he didn't know that was what it was, and he was just freaking out. He also heard like some whistling noises coming, and his first instinct was to grab his flashlight and try to get a better look at what was making these noises. So he reaches in his bag and he grabs his like headlamp that he had and a couple flashlights, and he shines it on the side of the creek where he's hearing like the noises, and he sees these red eyes staring back at him. And he said that the eyes were as tall as he was on his horse, so that would have had to be pretty tall. So we're talking, these eyes had to have been like maybe like 7 or 8 feet tall. And he kind of sees them staring at him. And then this is where it gets really weird. So he lays eyes on Sasquatch, right? And then the Sasquatch like almost starts to scream at him as if to tell him to leave. So then Rod would go back to camp that night, not getting a whole lot of sleep. Of course, because he heard some screeches and saw some crazy eyeballs in the woods. I probably wouldn't sleep very well either. So Rod would go back to camp that night, not get a lot of sleep, but he would actually return to that area 6 months later with his son. And in that same spot, there must have been, a family of Bigfoot living there, because they would find tracks that were 16 inches long, and they would be about an inch pressed into the soil. And they were able to actually get a cast of this Bigfoot foot impression from just going back to that same area. Pretty cool, right? And that would just be 2 of the first-hand accounts that came from Bigfoot Lives in Idaho. You go through here, there are just stories upon stories of, people in Idaho claiming to have seen Bigfoot. And one story that came up back in 2013 is the one that I really want to end kind of this segment on. And it was in 1970 that this woman claims to have lived with Bigfoots for 3 weeks. I honestly don't know why this didn't make national news, because this was huge. This story kind of came out and it was featured on a radio show called Coast to Coast. And on this radio show, Kaylee, the person who would be calling in, would call in and give a very detailed account of 3 weeks where she lived with Bigfoots. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story, but I'm actually going to link that video in the description box for you to watch it. It's about 13 minutes long, so if you want to watch it after this, you definitely can. But that interview was really, really interesting to me because she gave a lot of detail. So Kailyns is from Tacoma, Washington, and it's not uncommon for Kailyns to go out into the woods on her own. She grew up in the outdoors, and of course, the 70s was a very different time. So she would go to the Cascade Border Caves And this is at Devil's Fall National Park. She would go and hike into the falls, and while she's at the falls and planning on making camp at the base of the falls, she would be kind of washing up and getting ready for dinner for the night, and she would see almost this shadowy figure kind of hovering over her. And while she sees this shadow figure over her, she kind of like gets like this really eerie feeling, and she looks up and she sees that it is Sasquatch. It's Bigfoot. And she says that she faints, which I find really weird, but okay. So she passes out, and then the next thing she knows, she wakes up in a cave with this Bigfoot. And he's like in the cave, and it's super dark, so all she can really see is kind of his glowing eyes on the other side of the cave. And then she hears his voice in her head, and the voice says, don't worry, you're safe. We're not going to hurt you. Don't worry, we're not going to eat you. And so she claims that this creature was communicating with her telepathically. So then she would go with Bigfoot, and she would go to the base of the cave, and she said that she could then see the light kind of peering on him, and he appeared to be about 10 feet tall. He was like 800 pounds, really big, dark hair, dark eyes, and he would introduce her to 3 other Bigfoots that were kind of a part of his family. So then she says that she would be with them for 3 weeks. They would teach her to fish with her hands. They would teach her how to speak telepathically, and they would teach her how to heal. And so all of these things that she would learn over a 3-week period, they would let her come and go as she pleased. And she kind of lived with this group of Bigfoots for a couple weeks. And what she claimed is that she got to know them and kind of understand like where Bigfoot come from. So these Bigfoots would claim that they were shipwrecked about 90,000 years ago. There were 700 Bigfoots on board, and they were actually on their way to a planet that was basically like a work camp. It was kind of like a prison planet, and they crash landed on Earth and had been there for 90,000 years. And so they decided as a species that they would kind of go to all the 4 corners of the world, and then like make camps wherever they could. And then of course, like just kind of have family and try to grow as much as they possibly could. But that there's not very many of them, and that their family circles are very tight knit. And the one thing that I thought was really interesting is because they're long range telepaths, they said that anybody who comes and tries to do like a Bigfoot hunt or anything like that, they would be able to know miles and miles before they even came close to be able to make sure that they're not in that area, and then also to not leave any evidence. And their biggest thing that they want to do is be really discreet, and they don't want people knowing that they exist. They claim to be from a planet called Nuva, and Nuva would be in the Aries star system. I was really trying to find information about the Aries star system, and to be completely honest, I mean, scientists don't really think that life lives there. But I did find a star system that is nicknamed Aries, but it's actually called Antares. Antares is going to be 550 light years away from Earth. And so maybe that could be plausible that they would, pass by Earth on their way to this other planet. Not sure. But she does claim that she goes and visits them every year, and she's not opposed to bringing somebody with her, but that Bigfoots don't like to be taken photos of because they feel like that you are taking their soul when you take a photo. So maybe that makes sense as to why they don't want to be photographed and don't want to be seen. I'm not quite sure. Her story really did seem a little bit kooky, if I can be completely honest, but it was really interesting to hear the long-range telepathy that they are able to do. And so maybe that does kind of make sense as to why we haven't seen them and we don't have a whole lot of evidence, if they're just maybe 10 steps ahead of us at every moment of time. Interesting. So yeah, I'm going to leave that with you guys today, and you guys can kind of think, is Bigfoot real? Are these stories a bunch of hodgepodge? I mean, there are lots of footprints. There's lots of castings. When I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, I heard lots of stories about Bigfoot. And I really highly encourage you to just listen to that interview that she gave, because it was really detailed, very informational, and really interesting. So I'm going to leave you there to give your spook fix for the week. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.